Let me read something to you, and you might want to sit down for this one. I have been controlled by my parents for most of my life. I grew up with overwhelming anxiety. And for the first time in my life, since stepping away from my family, that anxiety has disappeared. Now, can you guess who wrote that? Because the person who wrote this didn't grow up broke. He wasn't neglected or left alone in some cold, forgotten childhood. The man who actually wrote this is a 26-year-old man who grew up in mansions. He is a man whose parents told every magazine on earth how much they adored him. He's a man who was at the fashion shows. He was at the red carpet events. He had literally everything that money could buy. And yet, even though he had all of that, he wrote this, basically saying he was suffocating in the background of all of this. And the man that I'm talking about is Brooklyn Peltz Beckham. Yes, you heard that right. Brooklyn Beckham is David Beckham's son, which is arguably one of the most famous footballers or soccer players alive. He is also Victoria Beckham's son, which you probably know as Posh Spice, fashion empire, global icon. Yes, that Victoria and David Beckham's son is who I am talking about. Brooklyn, the son of these two world famous people, on January 2026, posted this 6-slide statement on Instagram. And that statement, it just exploded all over the internet. And in that 6-slide statement, he said his family cares more about the brand that they created than about him, their own son. He went on to say in that 6-slide statement that his parents were trying to sabotage his marriage before the wedding ever even happened. He said that he grew up with anxiety that never let up, and that he flat out said that he was trying to not fix things with his parents. I want you to just step back and I want you to really let that land. Basically, what he's saying is that he is cutting off his multi-million, billionaire, whatever parents off. He's cutting off his parents who provided him with all of those luxuries. So obviously, the whole internet has opinions about this, and everybody is online picking a side and trying to figure out who's the villain, who's the victim, who's right, who's wrong, who's lying, who's telling the truth. And honestly, for me, it's not about who's right or wrong. I don't even think that really matters. As a counselor, what I actually want to know is, how does a kid who is raised with everything, who was raised with famous parents, who clearly love him on paper, raised with access, raised with every door open, how does that kid turn into a 26-year-old man who goes online and says his lifelong anxiety vanished the second that he walked away from his family? And as a counselor, my head explodes with curiosity when I hear something like that, because I can't help to wonder what was actually happening inside that house when the cameras were gone for a child to become a man to get to that point. That's some big, heavy statements that he's saying. And you might be asking yourself at this point, what does any of this have to do with me? Well, if you stay with me on this one, you're going to find out. So for those of you who are new to this channel, welcome. I'm Michelle McGowan, and this is Emotional Wealth. And today we're going deep. We're going to dive into the root of things, the generational root of things. And the important part of this video, just like every video that I make, is the fact that this video is never really about the person that I'm discussing. So this video is not really about the Beckhams or Brooklyn, even though I'm using them as kind of a case study for this video. What this video is really about is what happens when a family confuses love with performance, with approval. And when a family confuses love with performance, then acceptance becomes conditional on achievement rather than just inherent worth. Could you imagine if this is the case of what it costs a kid to be stuck in that type of environment? Because children in these type of environments, they learn that they are only valuable for what they do, not who they actually are. Which, when that child leaves childhood and becomes an adult, they suffer with things like loss of self, chronic anxiety, conditional self-worth, and so many other emotional and mental health struggles when you grow up in an environment where your performance is based on whether you get love or not. And maybe if you really took a step back and you thought about it, maybe you were raised in this type of environment. And if so, this video is really for you. So don't go anywhere and let's really dive in and get into it. Okay, let me start with setting up the scene a little bit here for you, because I really want you to grasp objectively this iconic love story, because it's probably one of the greatest love stories in the last 30 years or so. So picture this. It's 1997 and David Beckham is 21 years old and he's playing for Manchester United. And man, is he amazing at his sport. And during that time, he was literally becoming something that we hadn't seen before. He was becoming a football player, also known as a soccer player here in the United States. But he was becoming this global heartthrob of an athlete. And during that time, people weren't just watching him play. They were invested in him. Then he meets Victoria Adams, who is also known as Posh Spice. And Victoria, she is this posed, beautiful woman who came from one of the biggest girl groups on the planet. And bam, David and Victoria meet at a charity match. And it's almost like instantly happily ever after, because they fell in love with each other and they fell hard. The world was in it watching them fall in love with each other. So then by 1999, what happened? They got married. It was this beautiful picture of a marriage in this perfect castle in Ireland. They had golden thrones there and 437 staff members. Could you imagine having 437 people to just run one wedding? And in the middle of all that wedding frenzy, there's a 4-month-old son who is the ring bearer at this wedding. Their 4-month-old son who is the ring bearer at their wedding in front of all of the guests and all of the staff at only 4 months old. That's still a baby. And that little 4-month-old, his name is Brooklyn. And I want to pause here because as a counselor, I think this is really a pivotal moment in this child's life. I see something happening in that exact moment, in that castle, and those golden thrones, and that first photo of a baby in a christening gown at $1 million wedding. I see in that moment that Brooklyn Beckham was priming to become part of the brand. And from my counselor lens, I don't think that Brooklyn becoming part of the brand was due to Victoria and David being cold or calculating parents or people at all. And I don't think it's because anyone sat down in a boardroom and they decided to use this 4-month-old child as some type of tool. What I see and what I think was happening was that he was becoming part of the brand because the brand was the family and the family was the brand. It was ingrained in this whole entire dynamic before he even came about. It was part of the structure of that family, and nobody, not them, not us watching, ever separated the brand from the actual individual people inside of that brand. So let's fast forward here a little bit. Brooklyn grows up bouncing between London, Madrid, LA, and wherever else his dad's career drags him to. He grew up with paparazzi camped outside his school gates, with his birthday parties being written about all in magazines, with his parents' entire marriage turned into Netflix documentaries and TV specials and OK magazine covers. And if we really thought about it and traced it all the way back, it literally all started with him being photographed at 4 months old at his parents' wedding. This lifestyle of his that he didn't choose, this performance that he had to keep, it all started before he could even understand what a camera was. And it's so easy for people to fire back, especially when we're outsiders looking in, and to say, that would be a dream come true. That would be a life that I wish I could live. I mean, look at his life. He grew up with famous parents who obviously adored each other, gorgeous houses, and the whole world really just at his feet. And he should have nothing to stress or complain about, right? That's what as outsiders we perceive it. I mean, if we just really thought about it as outsiders, how can we not be a little bit jealous or envious? How can we not even question why he wouldn't be entirely grateful for this life that he was given? And he actually really does seem to be grateful. And maybe he is, maybe he isn't. But what I know about life is that it's not always black and white, and that there is always more to the story than what people see as outsiders looking in. So every time a journalist asked Brooklyn about his life or his upbringing, he would say all the right things. He would say things like, I have the best mom and dad in the world, that I would not change anything. I had a crazy childhood, that I was so happy. And like I said, maybe he was. And maybe all the things that he said and reported, at least at that time, he believed and he felt was true. And as outsiders, we consumed it. We just ate it up. I mean, of course we did. We developed these parasocial type of relationships with celebrities and influencers and famous people all the time. We buy into what they are presenting and what they are selling to us. They are influencing us in those ways. But I want you to remember, what we see or what's presented to us doesn't always match what's happening on the inside. And I want you to remember that, because by the end of this video, you might feel a little bit differently about how we get invested with the image that we are sold by celebrities and influencers. Okay, let's dive in a little bit deeper and get more into the psychological, interesting, and juicy part of things. Because there are several psychological patterns that I see in this family that I really want to point out in hopes that you'll be able to recognize the psychological patterns that are happening. So, from what I've been able to gather, at 15 years old, Brooklyn tried out for soccer, which, as you know, is his dad's sport. And he tried out at the Arsenal Academy, also known as Hell End, which, for those of you who don't know, is a famous youth academy that builds world-class soccer players. But unfortunately for him, he didn't get a scholarship, so he left. But this story, it doesn't end there, because next he tries modeling. And he books a Burberry campaign at just 16 years old. And what happens? The fashion world just eviscerates him in very public ways, calling him out, saying it was straight up nepotism, saying that he has no business being a model or being there. But he doesn't just give up. He then moves on and tries photography. And he published a whole photo book at 17 years old. And then what happens with that? Well, critics tear him apart, saying things like the photos were amateur and that the captions were worse than that. And that the only reason that his photo book even existed was because of his last name, because of the Beckham name. So what does he do? He drops out of art school in just under a year. And this poor kid, he just keeps trying over and over again to find something that can be his. And he keeps getting shot down and torn apart at every single turn, at every single thing that he is trying. But that's not it. Let's keep going on, because then he tries cooking, and he launched an online cooking show in 2022. And the production of this show, it was massive. It took 62 professionals and $100,000 to just shoot one single episode of this home cooking show. And of course, what happens? The internet does not let that go. So the internet, it rips him apart, which seems to be the theme of his story and his life. And as humans, we are skeptical and judgmental, and sometimes we're very critical. And what they were doing, they were judging him by his last name and not by the pattern of his continuous effort and the fact that he was failing and his effort was failing, but he just didn't give up. He kept going. And a lot of people turned to the internet, and instead of praising that fact that he didn't give up, they called him a spoiled rich kid who can't get his act together. They called him lazy. They called him talentless. They called him ungrateful. When what I see is this kid that had this drive to just keep going. No matter how much he was failing, he picked himself back up and he put himself back out there. And of course, it's easy to be judgmental, but I really don't buy it, not even for a little bit. I don't see this lazy, talentless, ungrateful, spoiled, rich kid who needs to get the act together. That's not what that pattern showed me. What I actually saw from my counselor and perspective from watching that pattern is a young man desperately, genuinely trying to find out who he is. I don't see this flaky, rich kid. I see a person who has really never once been allowed to just try to figure it out, to figure out who he is, what he likes, what he's good at, what matters to him. And he has definitely not been able to do that or try to figure that out in a quiet, private type of way without an audience. Do you remember yourself at that age, thinking back? Could you imagine trying to navigate life at that age and that being publicly ridiculed and crucified for every decision and choice that you were making at that age when you were just trying to live and try to figure it out? Because that's what we do at that age. I mean, just think about it. When you were a child or a very young adult, how the heck are any of us supposed to just know what we are good at, what we like, without trial and error? But for him, he wasn't allowed to have trial and error, because instead he was faced with judgment and hate and cruelty. His effort in trying to discover who he was getting monetized instantly. It was being publicized instantly. So he really never got the luxury that probably every single one of us got, which was to fail privately. Because failure is part of life, and every single one of us face some type of failures in our life. But most of us are lucky enough to not have it spread all out all over the internet. Because living in the life where you are expected to be perfect, where you are not allowed to fail, or when you did fail, the whole entire world watched and judged you. I mean, it doesn't matter how much money you have. Living that way will impact you. Honestly, just think about it in your own life. Think about the last time you failed and imagine that failure being publicized and criticized and plastered all over the internet. I know I would be horrified if that happened to me. Wouldn't you be? Let's continue on, because I want to talk about another significant thing in this story. So let me ask you, what is a name? I mean, actually, what is it? And I'm not talking about legally speaking, but what I'm talking about more is psychologically speaking. Because if you really stopped and you thought about it, your name is the first thing in your entire life that belongs to just you, right? Because our name is what we have before we have a job, before we have a house, before we even know who we are or what we want in life. Before any of that, we have a name, and it belongs to just us. Your name belongs to just you. And really, honestly, if we thought about it, everything that you'll ever experience, every feeling, every version of yourself that you become, it all gets stored inside of our name. Now I just want you to think about growing up with a name, one that is so famous, that belongs to a brand before it really ever belongs to you. Because Brooklyn Beckham wasn't just a kid with a name. He was a brand asset. And he was the second he was born into the Beckham family. I mean, if you really went on the internet and you looked back, you'll see that his name was in headlines before he could talk. His face was on magazine covers before he could read. His pivotal moments in life, like his first day of school or his first heartbreak, all of it was documented and sold. And the even crazier part of Brooklyn's story that kind of sets off alarm bells in my head as a counselor is the fact that Brooklyn stated that right before his wedding, he stated that his parents pressured him to sign away the legal rights to his own name. I don't even know how you do that. But anyways, just think about that. Being asked to sign away the legal rights to your own name. Your name, that is the one thing that you are supposed to have, that is supposed to be yours. The thing that you were given and have carried since birth. Let that just simmer a little bit, because that's not just a small detail. It's not just a hiccup in life. It's huge. And clinically, it really makes me think that inside this family, Brooklyn's name was never just his name. It was property. It was an asset that had to be managed and protected and controlled. And looking at it from this angle, this managed, protected, control angle, makes me think that his name seems to hold the same weight as a business holding holds. And he grew up inside of that weight and pattern his entire life, starting at just 4 months old. And clinically, psychologically, could you imagine what that does to a person's internal being, to their nervous system, to his nervous system? Our nervous systems are the part of us that constantly is scanning a room, reading what feels safe to us and what isn't safe. And as a counselor, when I heard this, I can't help but to think that his nervous system, it had to learn something that nobody ever said to him out loud because they didn't have to. From hearing this, I can't help but to think that his environment itself was teaching him every single day that you are not a person here. You are a product. And as a product, the focus is not on your well-being. It is on what you produce, what you can produce for us. Because products, they don't have needs. They don't get to be confused. They don't get to be messy. They don't get to quietly figure life out. What products do is they deliver. And that right there is the psychological toll that living inside a system like this has on someone. So yeah, the fame, the glam, the money, it looks wonderful and beautiful from the outside, but it doesn't ever show the weight and the toll of what's happening on the inside. But even though we think we know based on what we have been presented with, I think there's a whole lot more to him. And honestly, I don't even think he fully knows who he is. And unfortunately, as a counselor, I see that as a tragedy because everyone deserves the chance to just try to figure it out and to try to figure themselves out. But luckily for him, it isn't too late. So let's talk a little bit more about the psychology of things. Eric Erikson, if you haven't heard of him or don't know who he is this huge name in developmental psychology. He said that somewhere between roughly 12 and 25 years old, a human's main psychological job is what's called identity formation, which in plain English means that you get to try stuff. You actually need to try stuff. And in this stage, you get to be, or you should be, able to get to be at a point where you get obsessed with something for 6 months and then you totally lose interest after that. Where you should be able to make choices that blow up in your face. That you should be able to get to fail quietly, privately, with nobody grading you on that failure. And you should be able in this stage to be able to figure it out. And while figuring out, it's okay if it's messy, that it's slow, because it is forming you. It is forming who you actually are. And really, one of the non-negotiable ingredients for that identity formation to actually work is privacy. And I'm not saying like secrecy, I'm saying privacy, because the basic human need to have the right to figure themselves out in a room where the whole world isn't judging them and watching them. But as you can see, Brooklyn never got that room or that chance, because every single thing that he tried, it got sucked into the brand, into the money-making machine as soon as he went to go try it. Because let's just look at it again. His photography wasn't his photography. It was Brooklyn Beckham's photography that was reviewed by every stranger with a phone. His cooking wasn't his cooking. It was a 62 production for the audience to watch and judge. His relationships weren't just his relationships. They were tabloid plot lines that were splashed all over the internet. And there's a clinical term for this type of thing for what's happening in Brooklyn's life, which is identity diffusion. And identity diffusion is what happens when a person can't finish the normal work of figuring out who they are because the environment that they are in will not let them. It will not give them the chance. And from the outside, to us outsiders looking in, it looks like drifting, like flakiness, like a guy who can't commit to anything. But from the inside, from his perspective, I'm sure that it looks and feels like someone who is just frantically searching for a sense of self, and a place where self was never allowed to grow even in the first place. And here's the part that kind of just tears me up a little bit inside, which is the fact that Brooklyn has said himself that he grew up with overwhelming anxiety. And I want you to take note of that, because he didn't say that he grew up a little bit nervous. He didn't say that he grew up stressed out about school. What he said in his own words is that he grew up with overwhelming anxiety. That type of anxiety is the kind that lives, that's stored in your body. It's the kind that's there the second that you wake up, and it's still there when you're trying to fall asleep. It's the kind of anxiety that doesn't just go away because you have money or power or influence. And when I hear that specific phrase, overwhelming anxiety, coming from someone raised in a wealthy, loving, high access home, as a counselor, I know exactly what I'm hearing. And most people think anxiety means worry, like being nervous or worried about a grade on a test. But that's not what Brooklyn was describing here. What he's describing isn't a specific fear. He's describing a chronic childhood type of anxiety. And in living with that type of anxiety, it affects your nervous system in a way where your nervous system never really fully learned to power down or how to rest or how to calm itself down. So let's just zoom out for a minute. And I want you to try to picture this. Imagine you're sitting in a room, and in that room that you are sitting in, there are certain rules, but nobody tells you what those rules are. You just know there's certain rules. So instead of knowing what you're getting yourself into, instead of knowing the rules, you have to just go in and walk blind almost and figure them out by watching and observing. And you have to do this with a child mind and intellect. So you don't have the adult knowledge and wisdom and experience to guide you. You only have the child intellect and feelings that is trying to navigate this room full of rules that no one has told you about. So you have to do this just by taking a step back and trying to read the temperature of other people and your child mind by acting fast, because kids take this stuff in fast. You have to figure out on the spot which version of you keeps the room calm and which version of you makes the room feel tense or makes people upset. And because of this, your body, it just stays switched on all the time, always scanning the room and the people in it, thinking, am I doing this right? Because remember, you have no explanation or guidance. You are just a kid trying to figure it out all by yourself, trying to figure out, is this the version of me that's safe right now, that people accept right now? Is it okay to show up in this room like this? Is it okay, or do I need to do this or something else instead? And that constant amount of scanning, that non-stop, exhausting, never fully off amount of scanning, that right there is what Brooklyn is trying to explain when he is saying an overwhelming amount of anxiety. That right there is what anxiety actually feels like on the inside of someone who is saying that they are struggling with an overwhelming amount of anxiety. And that type of anxiety, it's not worry, it's vigilance. It's a nervous system that learned early on that it could never fully rest because the room was always demanding something, and getting it wrong could cost way too much. So there is no room for error, or at least that is probably how he felt, which bled into his anxiety, which he carried into adulthood. And honestly, the cruelest twists of growing up anxious inside a home that looks like a fairy tale from the outside is probably the fact that nobody believes you, that nobody believed that he could be struggling this way mentally, that he could be struggling with mental health or overwhelming anxiety. I mean, just look at his life. How could there be anything to worry about, right? But that right there, that is not the way mental health or anxiety works at all. Just because everything looks fine or looks even better than fine, that doesn't mean the struggle isn't there, that the struggle isn't real. And when someone is faced with this, and the second they try to say something feels off, and the world tries to shut them down and goes, what could you possibly be anxious about? That makes that person feel alone. It makes them try to shove it in and keep it inside and struggle by themselves. Because that question, when asked to someone who is struggling, it is one of the most damaging things that you can say to someone, because it teaches them to stop trusting their own gut. It teaches them that what they feel inside doesn't match what's supposed to be real. And then what can happen over time is that gap becomes the wound, and they suffer in silence. So yes, Brooklyn did in fact grow up in a mansion. And yes, he still had crushing anxiety. People can hold multiple truths at the exact same time. And honestly, emotional safety is never about what you have. It's about how the room actually feels, meaning that emotional safety has nothing to do with how much money is in your bank account. It's really about how your nervous system experiences things. So there is no amount of money, no amount of privilege, no amount of public, we love you so much. None of that can make a nervous system feel safe and calm if the room that the nervous system grew up in was quietly, constantly asking a child to stay alert and to stay vigilant and to perform to help keep others appeased. And I want us to back up even more here. I want to go a little bit deeper in a different direction. So I want to talk about Victoria and David, because after spending some time researching their life and looking into them in Brooklyn, I have found out that Victoria and David are way more complicated than the internet really gives them credit for. So here's the thing that makes things make a little bit more sense in Brooklyn's story when I look at things from a counselor lens, which is the fact that neither Victoria nor David built brand Beckham from a place of strength. They built their brand from a place of fear, which is a whole lot different than building from strength, meaning that the engine driving the achievement, driving the brand is based off of fear rather than based off of security. And when fear is the driver of the ship, the internal messages that come along with it are things like, I have to keep achieving or I'll become worthless. Or messages like, if I stop, then everything falls apart. Or success is the only thing that keeps me safe. Or I have to prove myself. Or if I'm not needed, then I'll be abandoned. Or failure is not an option because it threatens who I am. Those are the type of messages that come from something built from fear. However, if something is built from strength, then the messaging sounds more like, I know who I am, whether it succeeds or not. Or messages like, I choose to build because I love creating. Or messages like, success adds to my life. It doesn't define my worth. It doesn't define me. Or I can rest without believing that I'm falling behind. I can fail and still be okay. Do you hear the difference there with the messages of fear versus the messages of strength? Because when something is built from fear, the person or people often building it doesn't experience peace. And that's because when something's built from fear, that fear never really goes away. So with that being said, let's talk about what led me to this place of believing that their brand was built from fear instead of strength. So let's start with Victoria. From what I gathered, it looked like Victoria had a comfortable childhood, that her dad, he was very successful, that she grew up with money. I also learned that even though she grew up wealthy, that she got bullied, and she was bullied relentlessly. She actually has said herself that I was bullied, I was awkward, I wasn't particularly sociable, that I just didn't fit in at all. She talked about the fact that she used to beg her father not to drive her to school in his Rolls Royce because she didn't want to stand out. She just wanted to blend in. She just wanted more than anything to just be liked. I mean, what little girl doesn't want to just be liked? I also found out that her parents put everything on the line to fund her performing arts training. And when people really bet on you in that way, you tend to feel every ounce of that bet. So I am sure she felt the pressure, the weight of them funding her performing arts training. I am sure in that she felt the weight of what failure would cost. And then she auditioned for the Spice Girls. And by what she has stated, that audition and acceptance into that girl group was the first time in her entire life where she felt good enough. Just let that land. She used those exact words in her Netflix documentary in 2025. She said, good enough. And saying this at 51 years old, still describing that as the first time of feeling good enough, that right there, that's insightful. At 51, remembering the exact moment where you finally felt good enough, meaning that most of your life up until that moment, you didn't feel like enough. Now think about what she built on the outside while simultaneously feeling like not enough on the inside. She built a fashion empire, a global brand, a whole persona. And she did all of that while running on the script of not being enough in the back of her mind. And as a counselor, here's what I know from actually sitting across from people in the exact same position. Maybe not uber famous people, but sitting in front of people who have the internal feeling of, I am not enough. In order for them to control that feeling, everything that they do has to look and be perfect. So the narrative and the external life has to be managed within every inch of its life. It has to be controlled. But this is life, and it's impossible to control everything and everyone. So cracks, they happen. And when they do, someone who has to have control to try to fill and patch those cracks, they try to control every imperfection, including the imperfections of their own kids. Because no one, not even the people with endless amounts of money, will have perfect kids. So they have to control the narrative, because if they don't, then that can feel like a threat to their whole entire structure, to their entire nervous system, to their being. And they do this because if that structure cracks, or if the cracks show, then it confirms that they are not enough. And those old feelings that they feel about themselves, they feel like they win. Now let's switch it up and let's talk about David. David grew up working class in London. His dad, Ted, was a heating engineer and kitchen fitter who seemed to love his son David fiercely. He showed it the way he knew how to show love. Because that's the thing about showing love. We are only able to show it in the ways that we learned and know how to show. And he did this with David. And he did this by pushing him constantly. He pushed David to practice hours in local parks after full shifts at work. He pushed him to practice hundreds of repetitions. And if David got hurt, he pushed hard. So the message that David was sent was to get up and don't let them see you hurt. And from what I've gathered was that praise for David from his father, it was very rare. And that the pushing, it never really stopped. And the pushing, if we look at it, it worked. Because David, as you are aware, became one of the greatest football players who ever lived. But let's talk about the specific moment in his life where at 23 years old, he got red carded at the 1998 World Cup. And when this happened, he wasn't just criticized. There are literal sculptures and models of him that were being hung outside of pubs in England with death threats. And this happened daily to him. And it happened for a long while. So during this stage of his life, he seemed to be one of the most hated people in Britain. And he faced this at just 23 years old. And the way that I think David survived that, and the way that I believed his nervous system responded to that level of public attack, was by building a fortress of protection. And to him, it seems like family became that fortress. And what I think the rule inside of that fortress became was pretty simple and concrete, which is that you must have total loyalty to this unit, to the family unit, because the unit is the only thing keeping you alive. So now we have Victoria, who is a woman who carried the image of protection as armor. And we have David, who carried the fortress level loyalty as his armor. And together they built brand Beckham. And that brand, it seemed to feel like protection to them. And protection also became the walls that Brooklyn Beckham grew up trapped inside of. So now we have to ask the real questions here. And the question isn't whether David and Victoria are good or bad parents. The real question is, what happens to a kid who grows up inside of a family that is also a brand? What happens to a kid who grows up in a place where love gets performed in public, where loyalty gets measured by how fast you show up for the photo? And there's a term in family systems therapy for this, which is enmeshment. And enmeshment occurs when the boundaries inside of a family get so blurry that you literally can't tell where the family ends and where an individual in that family system begins. And in an enmeshed family, love and performance become the exact same currency. And in this type of dynamic, you can feel as if approval doesn't come free, that you have to earn approval, and that you have to earn that approval by showing up, by posting, by posing, by producing the right image, by becoming whatever version of yourself that has to keep the whole system stable and going. And Brooklyn said in his own words that brand Beckham comes first. And that family love is decided by how much you post on social media or by how quickly you drop everything to show up and pose for a family photo op. He said it himself right there. And that is a textbook description of an enmeshed family system for someone who lived inside of that enmeshed family system firsthand. He grew up in a home where he felt that love was never unconditional, where it was always on some level tied to how useful he was to the brand. And I want to be really clear. I'm not saying that David and Victoria didn't love Brooklyn. And I'm not saying they were bad parents. I actually believe that they do love him, that they've always loved him, that they still love him enormously. But loving someone and knowing how to love them safely and securely, those are two completely different skills. They're two completely different things. You can love someone with your whole entire heart and still not know how to do it in a way that doesn't quietly cost the person that you love something. And here's another important piece of the puzzle, which is the fact that growing up in a system where your worth is tied to your performance, and it's a performance where you were never given the script or the rules, then that kid learns to navigate the people in his life in ways that will cost him in the future, and ways that will turn unhealthy, and ways that you can't just shake off once you become an adult. That is a hefty price that comes with learning to perform as a child, to survive situations that you had no control over. You don't just stop paying the price just because you've entered in adulthood. That price only stops once you become aware enough to do something different about it. One of the major prices that Brooklyn paid was living with the constant, overwhelming feeling of anxiety throughout his entire childhood and even into his adulthood until he stepped outside of that family dynamic. Did he feel this sense of relief? And this is where we're going to actually talk about stepping outside of the family dynamic, because this is where everything kind of really blows up. So fast forward, Brooklyn gets married at 26 years old. And remember all of the 26 years of control and stuff that had been managed and contained. In this moment, it cracks open all at once, because this is what happens when you are exposed to things that help you see that your normal isn't really healthy or normal at all. It was just your life and it felt normal to you because it's all you've known. So April 2022, he married Nicola Pletz in Palm Beach, Florida. There were 5 guests, and Mark Anthony even performed at the wedding. And the wedding reportedly cost millions of dollars. And the very first crack in the brand, it shows up almost immediately during the wedding frenzy. So Nicola, she wears Valentino instead of a Victoria Beckham brand. And Brooklyn alleged that this was the case because Victoria had agreed to design Nicola's dress, and that Nicola was genuinely excited about wearing something made by her future mother-in-law. But what Brooklyn reported was the fact that Victoria backed out of making Nicola's dress at the last minute, which left Nicola to scramble and try to find a new dress with barely any time left to do so. And Victoria hasn't confirmed any of this, but this is what Brooklyn has stated as fact. But whatever really went down with that dress, it seems like the message from that situation that was sent to Nicola and to Brooklyn and to really anyone kind of paying attention was that the wedding was not safe territory. So the Beckham brand could not recognize it as such. So instead of extending loyalty and open arms, it had to stand outside of the protected fortress of the Beckham brand. And this, might I add, is one of the single biggest days of Brooklyn's adult life. It's his wedding day. It's a moment that's supposed to mark him becoming a husband instead of just a son. And it is one of the single most important events of anyone's life, of his life, where you shift from being just an individual to becoming a partner, to planning your forever with someone. And instead of holding and celebrating that shift with him, it cost him something. And it had a cost that was attached to it, just like most things in his life. And that's not even it, because then comes what Brooklyn has called the most humiliating moment of his entire life, which is the moment that Mark Anthony is singing and the crowd is gathered. And it's supposed to be the first moment where Brooklyn shared his first dance with his brand new wife. But instead, his mother, Victoria, steps in and dances with her son in that moment instead. She took over that moment on his wedding day in front of 5 people. Now, I want to be clear. I wasn't in that room, and I genuinely can't tell you what was going on in Victoria's head in that moment. Maybe it was intentional. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe she just had an emotional moment and wasn't thinking clearly. Maybe she just got swept up in the moment. I don't know. But what I can tell you is what that moment probably communicated to someone in a clinical sense, which is that your loyalty to this family is the most important thing no matter what. That you don't actually get to leave, and that I am still in control of this. Even if that wasn't the intent behind the moment, the messaging still probably hit in the same way. In intent, it never excuses behavior. And as humans, a wedding is one of the biggest prominent things, the biggest psychological rituals of a family really ever go through. It is really seen as the moment where a family officially says, this person is building their own unit in life now. Their priorities are shifting, and we honor and we respect that. In healthy families, even when it's genuinely hard, even when it hurts, they step back during those moments and huge life transitions, and they let the new couple step forward and start their life. But when a parent inserts themselves into the center of that exact ritual, instead of stepping back, like I said, the messaging behind that, whether intended or not, is that you don't actually get to leave, that I'm still in control here at the center of this. And that this transition, even though it's a huge one in your life, it still happens on my terms. And Brooklyn has stated that everything changed in that family dynamic after that day, and that the attacks on his marriage, it got relentless, that his wife was told that she wasn't blood, that she wasn't real family, that he flew to London for his dad's birthday and sat in a hotel room for a week trying to get time with his dad, and that David wouldn't meet with him except for at 100-person party with cameras everywhere. Just think about that. 100-person party with cameras everywhere. That right there, that can feel like a type of love that only shows up when there is an audience to perform for. And at 26 years old, he took a step back and he decided that his nervous system was completely, totally done with living like that. So what did he do? He left. He decided to step outside of that system. And here's where it gets messier, but it's still very important. Brooklyn didn't just quietly step back from his family. What he did instead was he posted a 6-slide Instagram statement. He blocked his parents. He blocked his siblings, and he fully aligned himself with his wife's family, who his wife's family are actually their own multi-billion-dollar American dynasty. He went even further to legally change his name to Peltz Beckham. He renewed his vow surrounded entirely by her side of the family, and he moved his whole life into their world, into his wife's world, and stepping outside of the life that he has always known. And a lot of people have pointed out, which I think is a fair point, that this doesn't exactly scream freedom here, that it seems like he just kind of traded one controlling family system for another. And I want you to take note of that, because I do think that there's some truth to that. And here's the truth that I see in this switching of families and the way that Brooklyn left his family dynamic, which was in this scorched earth statement way, this total cut off way, that dumping his entire family loyalty into a brand new family type of way. What I see from the way he went about things and my counselor lens is that he's not fully healed. Because as a counselor, what we see as secure detachment and family therapy is when someone has to block everyone and burn it all down just to try to basically flee the family in order to try to feel safe. So when this happens, that's usually a sign that the old system, that the old hold and the old messages still has enormous power over a person. Because someone who's genuinely done the work of separating their identity from their family of origin, they do not need to run that far or create a big scene in order to walk away from the relationship. When someone has done the work of healing, they can run into their family and still fully feel themselves in front of them. They can sit still when they are around them, even if they choose to not have those relationships with them. Because the relationship, they no longer have the same power or weight over them. They have more of a sense of freedom, not a need to run as far away as possible in hopes they do not run into them. And from what I am hearing and seeing from Brooklyn is that he is clearly not there yet. And that's okay, because it does sound like he is trying and he is working on it. But here's the part that I still see as incomplete, which is the fact that he, at 26 years old, he's carrying this system on his back since he was 4 months old. And sometimes, genuinely, the only way a person can even start healing is to get enough physical and emotional distance to just breathe first. And sometimes it extends further than that, where you have to get all the way out before you can even begin figuring out who you are on the inside away from that dynamic. But the reason that I feel like it's incomplete is because in the middle of all the chaos, in the middle of the drama, Brooklyn said that for the first time in my life, the anxiety has disappeared. I wake up every morning grateful for the life that I choose. And in saying that, I believe him. I do genuinely believe him. I believe that for the first time, he's actually breathing. But breathing for the first time, that isn't the finish line. That's really just the starting point, because the real work of figuring out who he is comes when he is not Beckham, when he's not a Peltz, when he is not performing for anyone's machine. And all of that is still ahead of him. And from what I see, that part hasn't started for him, not yet at least. But I do want to say that you cannot do that work until you can breathe first. And that the first time in 26 years of Brooklyn's life, he can finally breathe. And that can open the door to him healing. That is a huge something act. Okay, now let's shake it up a little bit. And I want to talk to you directly. I want you to think about the family that you grew up in. And I really want you to think about it. I'm not talking about the version of your family that you tell people when they ask, how was your childhood? Unless you just give it to them straight up. I'm really talking about the family that you grew up in when no one from the outside was watching, when it was just you and them. The part of you that you carry quietly, the parts of you that you don't really share or say out loud. And I want you to think about, how was love shown in your family? Did that love feel like it came with strings? Did that love feel like it came with acting or being a certain way? And when you're thinking about this, how love was shown, I want you to remember that feeling loved and secure and safe in childhood, that security and safety doesn't just get damaged from overt, obvious ways, like through abuse or trauma that's very talked about. Developing a lack of emotional safety and security, it can happen in childhood in ways that seem picture perfect normal. So for example, maybe there wasn't abuse, but there was a distinct feeling that came and that you felt when you were in a room when you said the wrong thing at dinner. Or maybe you experienced this shift in energy when you made a choice that your caregivers didn't love. Or this feeling that you felt when you brought someone home, someone that your caregivers, maybe they weren't expecting. Or that feeling when you wanted something that didn't fit into the picture of you that they had in their head of you. When you think about these moments, do you feel like there was love that was consistent, that felt unconditional, that felt secure? Or did you feel like something in the room changed in those moments? Just think about the brand that your family had. Because I can almost promise you that almost every family has a brand of some sort, an image that they try to sell to others. Because you do not have to be part of a global celebrity empire for there to be this type of situation, for that to be the case, for there to be that type of pressure. And that type of pressure of love, it can be tiny and can be quiet. where we are that family that doesn't talk about hard things, or where we are that family that always looks put together, or where we are that family that always is fine. Because honestly, every family has a story it tries to tell the world about who they are as a unit. And even deeper than that family usually has one person who is usually the oldest that pushes back on that unit a little bit and is the one who started living outside of the story. And because of that, they felt exactly what it cost to step outside of it. And I'm wondering, was that you? Were you the one who wanted something that the family had no room for? Who married someone that the family didn't approve of? Who chose a path that nobody in the family pictured or had planned for? Who started saying the true thing out loud that everyone else needed to say and kept quiet about? And if that is you, if you're sitting there right now and you're thinking, yeah, sounds about right, I need you to actually hear this, because I mean it with my whole entire heart, which is that the anxiety you grew up with was never actually yours to carry. It wasn't a flaw in you. It wasn't proof that you were too sensitive. It wasn't proof that you were too much. It wasn't proof that you were too difficult. It was just the sound of your nervous system working overtime every single day, trying to read a room that kept demanding a performance that you weren't sure you could keep pulling off, and that you honestly shouldn't have even been exposed to in the first place. But guess what? You get to put that down. And I'm not saying for you to do this by torching the whole thing like Brooklyn did. You don't even need to block everyone or post your own 6-slide statement about it in order to put it down. You can do this by doing it slower, quieter, harder work, the exact work that Brooklyn seems to be doing now. And you can start to do this by just first asking yourself the question underneath all of it, which is, who am I when I'm not performing for anyone's system? When I'm not trying to get others' approval? What do I actually want? And not what keeps the peace, not what earns the applause, not what fits the family brand, but what do I personally actually want? Because that question, as uncomfortable as it is, the honest answer, it might even cost you something. It might mean grief and losing things or people. It might even mean stepping outside a story your family has been telling for generations. But it is also the single most important question you will ever ask yourself. Because on the other side of the performance, of the managing, of all that exhausting effort to be whatever everyone else needs you to be, there's something waiting for you. And that thing that's waiting for you is the actual you, the one who doesn't need to be managed, who doesn't need to be branded, who doesn't need to perform for anybody. It is the one who just gets to be, and that is it. And that right there is not a small thing. Actually, it's everything. And that is what I call gaining emotional wealth. And again, I'm Michelle McGowan, and this channel is all about creating and gaining emotional wealth. And if this hits something real for you, send it to someone who needs the words for what they grew up inside of. Give them the language to help them become self-aware enough to create change. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't yet, because we go deep in this channel every single time. And thank you so much for watching. I'll catch you on the next.